Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this lunch event of the Illicit Trade Group. Also, warm welcome to all of you who are joining us online. Very great that we have such a large bunch of participants today. My name is Pim Groot. For those of you that don't know me, I'm co-coordinating the Illicit Trade Group together with Francesco Giamelli. And today we have a lunch event, an informal lunch event, in which we'll discuss the topic of modern slavery, labor exploitation. I'll introduce our speaker in a minute. First, let me say that we are going to record this session, but only the presentation. So the Q&A session will be edited out, and we will only record the presentation. I'll just mention a couple of future events. For those of you who are interested in that, we have a new lunch event on October 21st. We still have to decide who is going to present there. So if you want to, there's still a place open. And then a week later, on October 28th, there is a symposium of the school Sustainable Society. We're very happy with our collaboration, and we're going to use that opportunity to get to meet the ITG network and to discuss our future in collaborating. And of course, we're working towards a new winter school in illicit trade in January, where we hope to meet a lot of new students. Further, we would really like to take the opportunity in the October symposium, but also elsewhere, to discuss funding opportunities, try to collaborate on research. We are going to apply again for a cost action in a revised application, which we hope will be successful, and which will enable us to take this network to a much higher level. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker of today, Mirjam Wilhelm, who is Professor of Global Supply Chain Management in the University of Groningen. And she will talk about, a topic that I know nothing about, so I hope that this will be very enlightening, which is the Thai seafood business, and in particular the labor exploitation going on there, modern slavery in the supply chain. And I'm hoping for a very interesting talk with lots of new perspectives. I think we can all relate somehow to this. And Mirjam will primarily have probably the business angle, but I'm sure that we can meet with lots of different perspectives. Mirjam, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon also to everyone here in the room and everyone joining online. So this is a great opportunity for me that I'm very grateful for, that I'm able to present some of the insights of a research project that I've been involved in the past couple of years, since 2017 to be precise. I have a general interest in global supply chains and the topic of sustainability. I've been working a lot on the question how multinational corporations manage their supply chains, how they impose standards on their suppliers, lower tier suppliers up to the lower tier suppliers. So I did a lot of work on that. Recently I became particularly interested in the labor or the social sustainability side of things, and more extreme, let's say, violations of human rights and labor rights that can occur, unfortunately, in global supply chains. The case I'm going to talk about today is the case of the Thai fishery industry. Some of you might have seen the Netflix documentary Seaspiracy. At least my students always remind me of that one. So part of what I'm talking about today is related to that, but you will also see that the picture is maybe a little bit more complex and nuanced in reality. as often compared to the Netflix documentary. So yeah, I hope that I can give you a bit more balanced perspective on what was happening in Thailand and also the responses that different actors took in Thailand. This is a title of a newspaper article of the Associated Press, which says that 300 slaves were rescued from an Indonesian island after an investigation into forced labor. And what you see on these pictures is that these slaves were asked whether they want to return home after they've been held captive for years on an Indonesian island far away. And in between, they were forced to work on fishing vessels, Thai fishing vessels, fishing fish. But so to make sure that they don't escape and leave their captive situations, they were brought to these islands in between these fishing trips. So this was an article by the Associated Press, which also won the Pulitzer Prize Award, published in March 2015, which broke the story that about 1,000 migrant workers, mostly from Myanmar, were held captive on this Indonesian island of Benjina. And this is not necessarily an immediate response, but the topic of illegal fishing and forced labor in the Thai fishing industry is something that has been observed by the international community for a while. So the EU reacted shortly after in April 2015 by issuing a formal warning for IUU fishing. So that means illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. This yellow card, you might be familiar with that, is so Thailand is not the first country to receive this yellow card, but it's the first time that the EU has connected the issue of illegal fishing with the issue of forced labor. So the Thai government was explicitly asked to not only address illegal fishing, but also associated problems relating to human trafficking and slave labor. Modern slavery is realized as one of the grand challenges of our time. It's part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that call for stringent measures to end forced labor.
Yeah, excuse me, this slide is not on the recording.
Okay. It's also important to mention that there is not a legal definition what modern slavery is. Yeah, so there's not an official definition what modern slavery is, but the definition that is often used is the one of forced labor by the ILO, which will hopefully appear in a minute. Okay, yeah, thanks. So the ILO definition of forced labor is that of all work and services which are extracted from a person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered him or herself voluntarily. The terminology of modern slavery is criticized a lot by academics and who often see that this is a simplified opposition between free and unfree labor, and that the reality of exploitative working conditions very often lie somewhere in between. And that's not very well captured by the terminology of modern slavery. So the ILO, for example, doesn't really use that terminology. They talk of forced labor. But you can see, and we will see later, that this terminology of modern slavery has gained a lot of traction. It's very effective to arouse public emotions. And this is why it has been used a lot by activists and NGOs in this context. So I mentioned earlier that this is a research project that I've been involved in since 2017. We became interested in the Thai case, well, relatively shortly after the yellow card was issued by the EU. And there was a whole search of newspaper articles and media exposure on what is going on in Thailand. So Thailand is one of the biggest exporters of processed fish. 40% of the global canned tuna, so the biggest exporter of canned tuna in the world. And what is important to know is that very few or very little of the fish that is actually caught, that is processed in Thailand, is actually caught in Thai waters. So these vessels run with running under Thai flag are often fishing in foreign waters also. But there are a lot of processing facilities in Thailand. So the fishing and seafood sector that includes processing plants employed approximately 300,000 workers in 2017, and a large chunk of these workers are migrant workers, often from neighboring countries such as Cambodia and Myanmar. Fish workers, not just in Thailand, have often been treated separate from the terrestrial workforce. And as a result, they enjoy only weak legal protection. So one issue is that work on vessels is very hard work. The working hours are not regulated because it's certainly not a 9-to-5 job. These vessels, they go out on the water for several weeks, sometimes even months. So it's work which is very difficult to monitor and which is really weakly regulated, but also in terms of the labor laws that are behind it. The second issue, as I mentioned already, is that fishing is often occurring in international waters. So it's very difficult to, this is from a legal perspective, it falls into the gaps between national and international law. Okay, so the data that we collected was, as I said, we started in 2017, 2 years after the EU issued the yellow card. And also I have to say, 1 year we were also interested in the Australian Modern Slavery Act. So it was around the same time that the Australian Parliament was debating the Modern Slavery Act in Australia. We analyzed a lot of these reports that were published by NGOs on modern slavery in Thai fishing. And there were a lot of reports published between 2013 and 2019 mainly, which I think also influenced the EU decision to connect the yellow card to issues of forced labor. And we did around 50 interviews with key actors. So we started in Australia actually with interviewing seafood brands and retailers, but we quickly moved to Thailand during 3 field trips. And there we spoke to international seafood brands and processing firms. We talked to expert observers like the ILO or the IOM, international and local NGOs that were active in this field, also vessel owners, governmental actors, so mainly the EU, but also the Department of Fisheries in Thailand, philanthropic donors, which played a big role also in financing the work of NGOs in that domain, and also migrant fishers. So I want to focus on 3 parties now in terms of the responses to the modern slavery crisis in Thailand. So these parties are the Thai government, international and local NGOs, and seafood brands in Thailand. So this is the right slide.
It doesn't show here.
It doesn't show here. Okay, so so that means for those that are joining through the Google Meet, they're seeing the slide, I guess. Yeah. Okay. One further. Yeah. Okay. So I guess we have to just do it in parallel. Okay. So the Thai government responses to the modern slavery crisis. So of course the EU yellow card came as a huge shock for the Thai government. And that also occurred at the same time when they were downgraded in the so-called trafficking in person report of the US TIP report in 2014. As you may remember, there was a military junta which took over the government in Thailand in 2014. So that was also putting a lot of pressure on the military government to prove their legitimacy to the international community. So the Thai response has been incredibly swift. I think that has been acknowledged by all parties, that no other country has made such drastic changes in its fisheries and labor system. And Thailand is the only country in Asia at this stage that has ratified the ILO Work and Fishing Convention. Yeah? So Thailand really responded with a very, very drastic reform of its labor and fisheries system. At the same time, there are a number of problems which still remain. So the ILO Conventions 87 and 98 that relate to freedom of association and collective bargaining. These are core conventions that the ILO considers as core, have not been ratified yet to date, and that means that migrant workers cannot officially form unions or lead unions, which is a persisting problem, as I will point out in a couple of minutes. There has been a strong focus on prosecution of vessel owners and illegal fish workers. Very heavy fine imposed on vessel workers. There was no, there were very severe penalties for vessel owners. And a strong enforcement regime that was established. So in 22 coastal provinces, the Department of Fisheries, together with the Ministry of Labor, set up so-called port-in, port-out offices, or short PIPO. And these port-in, port-out officers, they basically audit or do checks of all vessels that leave the port and then re-enter the port. And that is, of course, to check for illegal fishing activities, the catch that is on board, but also to count how many workers left on the vessel and how many of them are coming back on the vessels. Because before that, there were often also reported incidents of murders on these vessels, or people going overboard voluntarily, not even involuntarily going overboard. So there was also a strong focus on fighting illegal migration to Thailand. Migrant fish workers had to register with a seaman book, which was separate from fish workers that were Thai nationals. Sorry, the previous slide. Yeah, so this is just an example. So, okay, this doesn't show. This is about the port-in and port-out system. So there was also a lot of use of technology, so-called iris scans were made from migrant fish workers. And I think that was also a way to separate them, I guess, from the regular workforce. But during these port-in, port-out checks, you could also not only count the number of workers that are on the vessel, but also could check whether verify the identity through these iris scan technology that was made use of. Another thing that the Thai government did is they invested heavily in modern slavery detection technology, or you could also say it's not only modern slavery, but also illegal fishing detection technologies. So each vessel, commercial vessel, is required, if it has a certain size, it's required to have a vessel monitoring technology, which is then connected to a satellite identification system. And what you see here is just an example of what you can then monitor. This way you can kind of see the fishing patterns or the moving patterns of these vessels. And this allows you to detect irregular patterns. So if two vessels, for example, are close to each other for a longer period of time, this could be an indication that transshipment is taking place. So transshipment is something where illegally caught fish is often then transferred to another vessel. And of course, from that, you can derive certain implications for forced labor, because often, fish workers that are held captive, they're often forced to stay for months on the same vessel. They don't return for the port. And of course, these transshipment practices facilitate that. But as you can also understand, it's a very indirect way to infer what the labor conditions on board are, right? So you cannot directly monitor labor conditions on board, but you can monitor the patterns of how vessels move. I said also earlier that there have been a very swift and radical response in terms of the Thai government, in terms of reforming their fisheries and labor laws. And as you can imagine, there was also huge resistance, particularly from vessel owners, who were now often faced with economic losses. Many of them had to also give up their boats. because either they have to pay high fines, high fines, but also because they're now forced to hire workers through regular channels, which cost them more, and at the same time there is a shortage of labor because it is harder for illegal migrants to for migrants to illegally cross borders and find work in fishing now. And that of course has become harder during COVID. So for I think the local fishing industry, this was a huge blow. And yeah, the COVID has made things better. So the vessel owners were responding with huge protests. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, so these were the responses by the Thai government. Looking at the NGO responses, that's, I think, also kind of interesting that this topic attracted a lot of attention from international and local NGOs. And particularly international NGOs such as Greenpeace or the Environmental Justice Foundations set up offices in Thailand and became very active in publishing reports and doing advocacy work. And I think, because they saw a huge connection between environmental issues of illegal fishing and human trafficking and forced labor that occur here. But it is notable that a lot of funding was available so that more than any other country, Thailand has received a lot of negative publicity for these issues, and a lot of funding from philanthropic donors was made available, and that also attracted a lot of NGOs, of course, who became very active in this space. And interestingly, a lot of NGOs that had no prior experience in working on labor or modern slavery, like Greenpeace, for example. At the same time, so the international NGOs were dominating the space. The civil society is rather weak in Thailand. I think you can say that. So for the local NGOs, it was a bit hard to define their own space and niche of where they could position themselves here. What these, sorry, but the further previous slide. So what you can also see is that particularly the international NGOs heavily drew on this narrative of enslaved workers and making use of the modern slavery terminology. So here you see an example of a report by the Environmental Justice Foundations that claims that if you buy prawns or shrimp from Thailand, you will be buying the produce of slave labor. I think that's kind of a very powerful statement. The reports are full of personal stories of traffic victims, really, really gruesome details. These reports, I mean, luckily not visuals, but there are a lot of details on really horrible things that are happening on these vessels. Like keywords such as trafficking, bonded labor, violence, murder, abuse. So there was a flood of these reports that were being published. Some questionable surveys also, like 59% of workers surveyed had witnessed murder. So really shocking details, of course, which were powerful in terms of raising public attention to this issue, and of course inspiring Netflix documentaries like Seaspiracy also. But at the same time, a lot of critics also pointed out that a lot of the responses were then channeled towards victim rescue as opposed to allowing better working conditions on vessels. And a lot of these rescued fishermen were often sent back home to Myanmar, Cambodia, where, they were struggling to find work. They were waiting for their pay. They had years sometimes of not being paid. So the modern slavery terminology is powerful. At the same time, it was also a bit distracting from the fact that all these fishers wanted was actually decent working conditions, right? So it's not that they didn't want to work on a vessel, but they wanted to have decent work. Next slide, please. I should look. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to skip maybe the next two slides. Okay, or maybe the previous one, sorry. So I also to point out, but something interesting also happened, I think, in this whole debate, because the incidents of modern slaveries, particularly those that occur on vessels, are very hard to link to actual brands because we don't know often how these vessels are connected to Walmart or Costco or Thai Union in the end, because these seafood brands, they often don't own. I don't actually think they ever own. So they don't own their own vessels, right? And often these seafood brands, they were not even aware, they didn't have any monitoring systems in place themselves that could tell them whether the fish that they processed and canned later was actually coming from these problematic vessels or were linked to illegal fishing activities. So there were some interesting things happening, again, by the Associated Press, for example, that was using this example of these 300 captive fishermen in Benjina. They were using, again, satellite technology to track the shipment from this island over 4 days until it reached the port in Thailand. And then they checked the US Customs of Bill, export custom of bill, to see who in the US is actually importing this tainted fish. And I think this was very powerful because this allowed them to actually connect these stories of these fishermen with global brands like Walmart, Costco, and so on, who then all of a sudden were put into the spotlight and had to do something about it. And coming to the next slide. So in terms of the company responses, as you can imagine, they were very mixed. These companies that were put into the spotlight were mainly concerned about managing their reputation. They did come together as a coalition in Thailand, the Seafood Task Force. It's a very secretive coalition. It excludes NGOs. You have to sign a NDA, non-disclosure agreement, in order to join these coalitions. I tried, but the NDA doesn't really help if you want to do research on this topic. So I preferred not to join the coalition. But one of the outcomes of this coalition is a code of conduct that they developed, which I think is not a very creative approach if you think about it. But the code of conduct, of course, that the Seafood Task Force came up with, and that includes all the major retailers and brands like Walmart, is very general. And that has been criticized a lot, that the code of conduct is not specific to vessels. And at the same time, there is no discussion, at least in the public, about how they want to audit these code of conduct, right? Because if you have a code of conduct, you also need to verify the actual situation on the ground. Otherwise it's just a piece of paper, of course. So I think the response of most of these global brands hasn't been very credible, I think. Maybe one company that stands out is Thai Union, and that's also because Thai Union became something like the face of this crisis. It is a Thai-based company, but it's one of I think it's the third biggest global seafood brand in the world. It owns John West, for example. But because they have the word Thai in their name also, they couldn't really distance themselves from what was going on in Thailand. And so I think they were also the most active, and still today, they're the most active in trying to find a response to this crisis. And some of the things they did is they actually designed their own, they're also part of the coalition, but they designed their own vessel code of conduct, which is much more specific to the conditions on vessels. They invested also in auditing vessels more. They invested also, and I think this is quite novel, at least for this industry, in an ethical migrant recruitment policy. So they actually went to the country, to Myanmar, and specifically to the origin of labor, or they started to trace the supply chain of labor, because that's something that a lot of companies actually don't really understand, and start to work with recruitment companies in Myanmar to make sure that no fees are being charged for workers, because this is the process, of course, of how workers often become indebted. They become indebted in the recruitment and migration process. So that's one of the things they did. But it's also important to understand that to date, at least, they only did it for their own factory workers, not to those workers, not for the vessel workers, but the workers that work in their own processing plants. They also, sorry, just the last point maybe, they also strengthened worker welfare committees, and I think that's also something interesting. So it's kind of like a substitute for unions in factories, because as I said, in Thailand, it's difficult for migrant workers, or let's say difficult, impossible for migrant workers to set up their own union or lead unions. So they came up with this mechanism of worker welfare committees where migrant workers could be elected and also advocate for their own issues. But again, something that's mainly happening in their own processing plants as opposed to the vessels. Okay, I'm coming towards the end of my presentation. So has the situation for vessel workers improved? I think that's an interesting question, and one that is a bit more difficult to answer. So certain things have improved. So I think one thing you could say is that these very extreme cases of human rights violations, people getting murdered or getting abused on vessels, I think that has certainly declined. So there have been less reports on that. And here this information is coming from a survey that the ILO did. So they had a baseline survey in 2013, and they did another survey in 2018 where basically they asked the same questions to workers. So from that you can see that the conditions, first of all, what you can see is that there's a huge difference still between workers in processing plants and workers on vessels. And the situation for workers in processing plants has definitely improved, because that's also easier to regulate and to monitor. For the vessel owners, as I said, the vessel workers, the extreme cases of human rights violations have been decreased. But there are still some remaining issues, one of them being deduction from wages. That is still high, and if you consider this deduction, then often the salary or the wage that the workers are earning is still significantly below the legal minimum, so that's obviously a problem. Withholding of wage payment is also still quite common and has actually even doubled. And 55% of the migrant respondents in the fishing sector still pay the recruitment fee. So that is still an ongoing, this is still a remaining issue. Okay, so the conclusion is, so I think these extreme cases of forced labor were mitigated through these responses. In that regard, the responses were effective. However, the whole issue of improving working conditions for vessel workers, but also factory workers who want to have maybe the basic rights of freedom of association, that has still not been addressed. The government responses were mainly focused on prosecution and criminalizing vessel owners and migrant workers. And as I said, partly this has been effective, and as a result of that, the yellow card was also revoked in January 2019. So the EU acknowledged the reforms, the drastic reforms that the Thai government did. But when it comes to decent work in fishing, I think there is still room for improvement. The NGO responses, as I said, this narrative was helpful in really raising public attention, and it was a very emotive topic for a lot of people. But it also led to a victimization of workers and didn't necessarily improve their working conditions. In terms of company responses, I also pointed out that these were quite mixed, but even those companies that were more committed, because they were put much more in the spotlight maybe, but that really had to do something, so far at least, the responses were mainly geared towards their own workers in their own factories, rather than the vessels. Okay, then right on time, I hope. Okay, so thank you very much for joining online, and I think there's a Q&A now, right?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Miriam, for this presentation. I'm just trying to position myself in such a way that people can view me online as well. So thanks a lot. Let's see. There's room for questions.